Hey friends, welcome back to the Do Cool Shit podcast. It's Meryl, and today we're going to talk about this really big topic that is constantly reoccurring, and honestly, I'm grateful for it. And that topic is cognitive flexibility. And we're going to talk about why bending is real strength and why that is where lasting change actually happens. First, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard the saying, if you don't bend, you break? I'm going to have you, we're going to do a little visualization right now where I'm going to have you picture a tree in a storm. A rigid tree, like an oak, stands tall and it's strong and it's unmoving. But when wind gets intense enough, those really stiff branches snap. You picture like this really big storm, high winds, and that tree, looks really strong and sturdy standing there. But when wind takes a toll of it, that ship breaks. But now, if you picture a willow tree, something that is bendy and something that you may look at and not think strong, sturdy, etc. It bends, it moves, and it almost looks fragile. But when a storm hit, it survives it, and it usually actually comes out intact. And this is kind of how our minds work. Our minds work very, very similarly. And I feel like I need to add this fun fact in. My husband, Josh, who is like a full-blown environmental nerd and has taught me somewhat about arboriculture, which I didn't even know that was a word until last year, would probably be so proud of me for knowing these trees. But that image has stuck in my mind a lot, I would say lately, but like really in the past year. The past month, I don't know about you, like January felt like 85 days. And it really has shown me exactly where I have been acting like the oak, kind of unknowingly, and where learning to bend has mattered more than forcing that strength. And I'm, going to get into some personal shit later. But first, I want to explain what cognitive flexibility really means. Cognitive flexibility isn't about lowering your standards or abandoning your values or even your goals. It's actually the opposite. It's about being flexible without losing your direction. It's about being smart enough to adapt when things change, without throwing everything out the window. Cognitive flexibility is the skill that lets you bend so you don't break when life inevitably throws you curveballs. We all want things to go like easy breezy beautiful, but we know that's not reality. And honestly, the difference between people who make long-term progress and the people who are stuck in endless restart cycles usually comes down to this one skill. It's not motivation and it's not discipline. It's the ability to adapt without completely abandoning ship. So I mentioned that the past month kind of kind of rocked me in a little way. There was a storm for sure, and I'm not gonna talk about everything right now because I'm not quite ready to, but there were a lot of things in the past month that rocked me, that were very unpredictable and very much changed what things look like. And I noticed how attached I was to how things were kind of like supposed to look, or how I was relying on things being routine or similar. And then when things shifted and I had very little control in these situations. I was kind of like stuck. I definitely had like this nervous system heightened reaction to it, this stress response to it. And I'll be, you know, so honest that my first instinct there was not curiosity. In reaction, my first instinct was frustration. And I felt like, like my schedule shifted. I got sick. My energy levels were not what I expected them to be. There were a lot of things that were going like really, really well. And then some shit kind of hit, and those things just didn't feel like priorities and kind of moved down my priority list. And, I let them eventually. My normal systems just felt harder, and some of them were not working for me as I kind of had expected them to be. And I had thoughts that were like, oh, this shouldn't feel this hard. Or if I can't do things this way, then like, what the hell do I do? And I had to really fight that urge to just like push through and feel like I needed to get quote unquote back on track. When I did let myself sit in that and I got past that reactivity, I realized like that's rigidity. You know, nothing was technically wrong, but my nervous system was treating these disruptions like a threat. And I had a really big shift when one, I had some just kind of radical acceptance of what was going on. And when I stopped asking myself, how do I force this to work? When I stopped trying to force this square peg into a round hole, and I started asking myself what bending would look like here, picturing myself as the willow in the storm instead of trying to be that oak that just like stands tall and tries to withstand the storm. This is where really big shifts happened for me, and I'm entering into February. Not that a month to month is like an arbitrary thing, it just happened to line up that I would say especially the past 2 weeks were really rough and very different, and a lot of shit. And being able to be flexible through those things and not get stuck in that stressed state, that rigid state, has allowed me to enter into this week, into this month, feeling like a little bit more normal, definitely feeling regulated. I got to use a lot of my words, my regulated, courage, play. I got to use these in so many different ways than I even thought that I would. So that's cool, right? It didn't feel cool necessarily while I was doing it, but it is. That was me doing cool shit. So, this is a skill that it shows up a lot in my life. It shows up a lot inside Wicked Iron Strength with my clients. And, it's usually not in dramatic moments. It's usually in small pivots. And here are some examples I wanted to throw out, like some very much more clear examples, because I know I have some subtle foreshadowing, but I didn't give you specifics. One of my clients was unexpectedly short on time on a gym day. And in the past, she would have skipped it entirely. And instead, she went in and did what she could in the time that she had, and then left feeling proud and left feeling like she wanted to do more, had that kind of internal motivation to like go back to the gym later instead of feeling defeated. Another client was traveling to see a family member, and it was, under some emotionally heavy circumstances, and her schedule was uncertain. her her Airbnb fell through and she had to switch to a hotel last minute. So that, changed things with her nutrition a lot. And in the past, she would have hit the fuck it button with her nutrition, but mostly because she couldn't cook what she had planned, and food had kind of been like a comfort tool in the past and before, and this was something she was working on. And this time she paused and she grabbed a few supportive items for the mini fridge she had at her hotel. She looked for menu items intentionally when she went out to eat, and she reminded herself that nourishment would actually help her feel better and not worse. And that didn't mean, not having certain foods. She did add in certain foods intentionally that were comforting. And she also added in, those foods that she knew would help support her capacity and her well being. And here's another example where one of my clients was doing push-ups in her workout, and she was like, "Oh my god, these are brutal." And, after the first set, she had noticed this thought that was like, "Okay, that's good enough. Oh, we can move on. I can stop now." And in the past, she actually would have. She noted to me, "All right, did those. Like, I'm going to move on. That was hard. I did it. I'm going to move on," even though she had more to do. And this time, instead of completely moving on, she just modified. First set she did from her toes, and then the next set she modified down and dropped to her knees. So she finished out the sets. None of these things are like earth shattering moments, but these are all I would consider small bends. And all of these small bends are what compound into massive change over time. When people stay rigid, it keeps them stuck. That rigid oak mentality keeps people trapped in cycles of self sabotage. When standards exist without flexibility, there's a ton of room for failing to meet them, because I say this all the time, we're humans. We're not robots, you know? And then we use that failure as evidence that we're not capable, we can't stick to things, that something is wrong with us, and that creates chaos, and chaos kills confidence. But when you learn to bend like that willow, you interrupt that cycle. You stay focused on what actually matters. We hear, consistent progress over time is what matters more than perfection, right? Persistence over perfection. Um, you gain confidence in your body and mind. You gain self trust, in your ability to handle whatever shows up. And I will always say that so many people don't have a follow through problem, they have a self trust. Quote unquote problem. And when they can gain self trust, then lots of other things change here. And, our brain has kind of default settings. Our brain will always default to what's easiest, what's most familiar, what's most comfortable. And if you've lived in all or nothing cycles, black and white thinking as your default, the gray areas are not gonna be where you go to. Gray areas require more effort. They require more awareness, more regulation. And while I totally believe in making supportive choices easier wherever and whenever possible, easy is not what builds the life you want. Growth feels uncomfortable. Change is hard. Leveling up requires capacity. That's the process. That is the process that we have. So, yes, there are ways that we can make our default more supportive. But we also have to do things that feel challenging and hard and uncomfortable and new in order to do that. The coolest shit happens in the gray area. And that is where you pivot without giving up. That is where you find solutions instead of excuses. That is where you build self-trust because you have proof that you can handle uncertainty. And we've talked about transformation before. That real transformation does not exist in perfect execution. It lives in that messy, imperfect, gooey navigation of real life where you're using wisdom that you have and you're using adaptability. So let's talk about how to practice this moving forward. One is I just want you to start to pay attention. Start catching yourself when you're being that rigid oak tree and ask yourself, how can I bend here instead of break? Maybe bending looks like self-compassion, where you cut yourself a little slack. That doesn't mean, giving up or going the opposite way. It means you're holding yourself accountable, but you're also like you're showing yourself flexibility. You're allowing yourself to shift what things look like while also owning um and having self accountability. It may look like a shorter workout instead of none. It may look like going for a walk if you can't get to the gym. It may look like planning tomorrow instead of ruminating on what yesterday looked like. It may look like recognizing that setbacks is just y- part of it. It's just that wind in the storm. It doesn't mean that you fucked up. Remember, the goal is not perfection. The goal is never perfection. So if you're thinking that it needs to be one way, then that is a sign that you're trying to be the oak, building the mental flexibility that lets you weather any storm that life throws your way. And this is what real strength looks like. Not rigid rules that snap under pressure, but adaptable resilience that bends without breaking. The willow doesn't compromise its strength. It uses flexibility as its superpower. And your journey towards better health and a stronger mindset and genuine confidence isn't about flawless execution. It's about becoming someone who knows how to adapt and continuing to move, continuing to do. That's the difference between temporary change and the lifelong transformation that I'm learning to not have the ick when I use that word. And now you know what I mean when I use that word, and you know how to suss out when people are using it in a bullshit way. So now is the time for you to go do the cool shit. Go into your life in this next week and use flexibility as your superpower. See what you gain when you do that. It is going to likely feel uncomfortable. Just know that that is going to likely be a feeling that you feel as part of this. And keep moving through it. Keep tolerating that discomfort. Look for ways to be flexible, to adapt, to adjust instead of abandoning, and see what cool shit happens. Report back. I would love to hear about it. And as always, I am so grateful for you being here, and I will talk with you next time.